American lives are at risk and Americans are dying, is to unite behind the troops until victory is won. Now, on this show, Buchanan and Press, we've had a good debate for 8 months on this conflict, but now it seems when the war comes, the debate ends. I think unity, Bill, is essential at this time, or at least when the guns begin to fire.
It's a very effective tactic, at least in the short run, to a large extent, to say, look, you've got to support the troops. And that's an effort to conflate supporting the troops with supporting the president's policies.
Once the war against Saddam begins, we expect every American to support our military, and if they can't do that, to shut up.
In addition to Phil Donahue, many other journalists have been silenced for crossing the mythical line known as objectivity.
Today, NBC News fired journalist Peter Arnett this morning for participating in an interview on Iraqi state-controlled television.
Arnett criticized American war planning and said his reports about civilian casualties in the Iraqi resistance were encouraging to anti-war protesters in America.
If you're pro-war, you're objective, but if you're anti-war, you're biased. And often a news anchor will get no flack at all for making statements that are supportive of a war and wouldn't dream of making a statement that's against a war.
I must say I was trying to think of something that would be appropriate to say on an occasion like this, and as is often the case, the best you can come up with is something that Shakespeare wrote for Henry V, wreak havoc and unleash the dogs of war.
And that is a tip-off to just how skewed the media terrain is. We should keep in mind that CNN, which many believe to be a liberal network, had a memo from their top news executive, Walter Isaacson, in the fall of 2001, as the missiles were falling in Afghanistan, telling the anchors and the reporters, you need to remind people, anytime you show images on the screen of the people who are dying in Afghanistan, you've got to remind the American viewers that it's in the context of what happened on 9/11, as though people could forget 9/11.
Where we talked to several people who told us that various friends and relatives had died in the bombing there, in that collateral damage. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kandahar, Afghanistan.
And we would just remind you, as we always do now with these reports from inside the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, that you're seeing only one side of the story, that these U.S. military actions that Nick Robertson was talking about are in response to a terrorist attack that killed 5,000 and more innocent people inside the United States.
Kandahar, and we juxtapose what we're hearing from the Taliban with a live picture of the cleanup that continues in Lower Manhattan. Ground Zero, again, a 24-hour operation that has not ebbed. 5,000 killed that day back on Tuesday, September 11th, their biggest crime, as civilians going to work that day.
And yet, we know statistically, the best estimates tell us, that more civilians were killed by that bombing in Afghanistan than those who died in the Twin Towers in New York. And the moral objections that could be raised to slaughtering civilians in the name of retaliation against 9/11, those objections were muted by the phrase war on terror, by the way in which it was used by the White House and Congress, and also by the news media.